Welcome back, everybody, to the Marketing Rules podcast, and it is my pleasure to be joined by Peter Shafer. Peter, I asked you kind of before we kind of started recording to how I would describe you, and I think we settled on kind of data strategist, data collection strategist, marketing data strategist, something to do with data, marketing, and strategy. It all kind of seems to fit in your kind of in your background and your expertise. But could you maybe describe your kind of about your background and yourself to our audience?
Absolutely. And James, it's great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. My expertise really focuses in on three particular areas. One is using data to make decisions, whether they're strategic or practical, tactical decisions during day-to-day work. The second is how to use data in a more public way. I worked with the Gallup poll and the Harris poll, where that data went into news stories and went into promotions and different things like that. And then the third is really to help people understand how to capture and really begin to harness that data for as it comes in, because there's so many new data sources that come out, or that there's new data that you're exposed to, and you're trying to figure out how to piece it into what you're already doing. So I work with a lot of clients around that, and helping them understand the implications of those data and what it means to use those data.
So, I mean, this must be a golden age for someone in your line of work. Since the advent of big data, with the air quotes, if anyone's
Yes.
and everybody's more focused now on data driven decisions. I know we're going to talk a little around marketing and data driven marketing, but this must be just kind of, you must be in your element right at the minute, because we got so much data at our fingertips.
You're absolutely right, and I think it's both. I think the golden age is a very good way to describe it. One thing that does surprise me is just the continued, accumulation of more and more and more data. And I think in many ways, while that's exciting, it's also very much overwhelming to somebody in marketing right now, because there's so many different data sources that they can pull on. And the question becomes, what's the highest quality? What's the best indicator for us to follow? Because even just using one software package, you could get multiple reads of data on the same particular topic. And sometimes it's volume metrics, sometimes it's qualitative data. But I think the big challenge is just really getting comfortable with the idea that there is so much data.
Well, this is going to be amazing. I mean, is there such a thing as too much data, right?
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
we're swamped by it on a daily basis, right? And I think it's just, I think, and again, we can touch on this. Is one of the things that I think a lot of, you know, generally businesses find and marketers find, is that we just don't know where to start. There's just so much data, and then that's one point, and then the second point is, well, what do I do with all that data? How do I put
Right.
that into a form that makes sense, that from a marketeer's perspective, that generates return on investment, that proves return on investment, just to do something with it. So, I mean, maybe that's a good place to start. Is kind of just, you've got all this. There's all this data out there. Where do we start?
Yeah.
What?
And
Yeah.
it's a really excellent question, James. And I think a good starting point is just to really accept the premise that I have all this data at my disposal, whether it's data within my organization or data within another part of the organization that I can access to. But you really need to start with, okay, what do I want to find out from the data? What is it that I need to either understand or um, use that data to make a decision on? And I think one of the things that I talk about a lot with clients is that they expect when they get a data report or they get the data that there's this big, shiny, bright yellow answer right in front of them, and it doesn't exist. Sometimes they have to piece it together, and so it becomes a puzzle that they work with. And it could be a Rubik's cube, it could be a 1,000-piece puzzle, but it's not as simple as here's a data point, go do what you have to do. The
And
other
and is,
start. I'm
and
sorry.
is there a reason then that should kind of businesses start looking at or either kind of bring on some like yourself, or having someone internally that can just manage this data, or understands data, because I think that's one of the problems as well, right? You just
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and that's one of the recommendations that we make, is that at least there is somebody in the organization that is the champion of the data, that understands not only where it comes from and what's available, but then also how to use it. And they don't necessarily have to be a quote unquote data scientist. They just have to understand how these different pieces of data can work together. And sometimes that's a CIO type person, but oftentimes, in organizations that it's just somebody who is keeping and taking care of the flows of data so that I can understand it, or that we can understand it. But I think you're right. If one of the best practices that I've seen is that you appoint a champion who sits, and that's one of their jobs, is to really focus in and hone in on that data.
And what's the job description look like for someone like that? Because again, as a marketeer, my interest would be, right, what can I'm not that interested in kind of. I want to see how it could be creatively used, right? What can
Yep.
I tease out that, and instead of just looking at it as a set of numbers and saying, right, the numbers mean this, this, and this, like an accountant,
Yep.
but being creative with that, So how what does that person look like? That
Well, it's an excellent question, James. And one of the things, this is something that hasn't really caught up yet, and that is our own individual education around how to use the numbers is so far behind the volume of data that we get. So when you ask that question about what type of person, even some of the people that are coming out of MBA school have only been exposed to it probably about that much. It's not, so it's still developing. What I would say is you want to look for three particular personality types. One would be somebody who is what I call a data detective, who likes to be able to work with the different information, piece it together, and come up with it. And that might be somebody who's got great ideation skills. It might be somebody who's able to pick out, but that detective idea is one that seems to resonate with people. The second is that the person should have at least some analytical background and be comfortable with speaking and writing and talking about what the numbers actually mean. And I see this a lot. There's a group of people that are in banking and in other industries where they have just incredible amounts of data that actually know how to handle in that, and they can be that those skills can be transferred over into other organizations somewhat easily. So that analytical analyst type person. The third is somebody who is just really, really hyper organized on things, simply because they need to be able to prioritize and be able to put these pieces together in a more structured way. I worked with a person several years ago in one of the polling firms that I was with, and they were super super diligent about being able to say, okay, this data goes here and this data goes here, and that organization really helped our organization then use the data effectively, both in terms of day-to-day decisions, but also in strategic direction. This is where we think the market is headed. So again, one of the things this is kind of a fourth one, I guess, would be somebody that is at least comfortable with uncertainty, because at the outset of many of these projects, even if you're doing something that is a pretty rigorous and structured project, is that there is some uncertainty, and you've got to be okay with that and not to jump to a conclusion before before we get to the data itself.
Yeah. Um, well, it just kind of occurred to me that obviously the majority of the audience we're talking to today are in the you're all in the HR and recruitment space, and there are some nuances around data usage within that space. Obviously, kind of personal data. We've kind of got hang-ups
Yes.
from kind of EU legislation, kind of GDPR as we call it over here.
Yep.
How does that affect your usage of data? Do we how careful do we need to be? And I know this is kind of more legal aspects, but that must have an effect on the data sets you can kind of use. If you can't, if you're going to use so much of it, it must affect the outcome, right?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and I think it's a struggle that is, people have defaulted more to being overly cautious than to being maybe more risky with the data. First is that and this is a finding that I find interesting but not surprising, and that is that most people understand, most consumers understand, and most employees understand as well, that there is a numeric value that they can put on their data, and that they are aware of their own rights, privacy rights in this. So the first thing you do when you're working with this type of HR data is strip out and anonymize as much of the personal information as you can. And that is, kind of step one, and it's the biggest step. It helps legally, and I think, at least here in the United States, any of these quantifications become discoverable if there is an HR action down the road, or if there's some other, issue that pops up. Um, the second is that in those groupings, after stripping out that personal information, if there's anything in there that could be sensitive, or a data point that might be uh, leading down the path, and I'll use this example. If you have age as still a variable in that set, once you've stripped out everything, age could be, that could be a problem area. So you want to make sure that some of those hot button areas like age and gender and things like some of those demographics, you protect for as much as possible. And the third is, if you do get into an area where it is a sensitive topic, you limit the number of people who can actually access the data, and you limit the number of people who can actually manipulate and work with the data. And oftentimes that's actually the simplest step, because you can say, okay, this is what we need to find out. Let's say we're trying to find out a new a salary range for a new position that we're hiring. That the fewer the people that have access to that data, the better. And usually it's say, okay, one person can go over here and do that, but you lock it down as much as possible. Those are the three areas that I've seen have been fairly successful. But you're right. I mean, more and more people are aware of how valuable and how much say they have in how their data is used.
Mhm. I'm just thinking of loads of questions to want to ask you, Peter,
Oh,
as we
yeah,
go along. So I've got another one for you. And again, I'm trying to kind of refer this back to some of the questions that we've been asked with some of our clients, and I know the audience will probably have these around quality of data and cleansing of data,
yep,
and how how you tackle that, right? Because if you're pulling data from multiple sources, how do you sanity check that? How do
yes.
you know that? Does it need to be peer reviewed data? Does it need to come from multiple sources that equate together? I don't know. How do we do that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and data hygiene is a big issue right now throughout almost every industry category. I know specifically in the market research area, it definitely is. But you just said something that struck me, and that is that um, I am an advocate for a casual peer review, just to make sure that what we're asking and what we're thinking about and how we're asking, or what we're using the data for, is at least tested or seen by somebody who is not involved directly in the project. And that checkpoint, that simple, hey, this does meet kind of the litmus test. Yeah, I've this might be observable in the public, is usually a good step. And I think people breeze by that, or they go to the person who's the closest to the project and ask the same thing. But the one thing I would say is this, and the the peer review part of it, there is actually, and I know that you all know this, in academia, a very rigorous process for that. And that's not, we're not talking about that. We're talking about just, hey, on its surface, does this appear what you do? One thing, and you mentioned it a second ago as well, is that if you are looking to answer a bigger question, it may not necessarily reflect what is going on in the world right this minute. So you need to just account for that there could be a surprise answer there, or there could be something that you see that is not necessarily in the what would be kind of in the normal course of business. For example, if you're a staffing firm and you post a particular position, and you see an overabundance of people applying for that, and you start looking through the demographics, and it becomes clear that, hey, more women than men are applying for this, or there's something along those lines, that may trigger a different way to go, or different decision making process. So, if at all possible, don't start jumping to conclusions until you've actually had a chance to sort through some of the data. I see this happen quite frequently, and I know you do, James, too. Is that, here's my hypothesis, let me go out and find the data to support it, versus here's the data and let me build the hypothesis from
Yeah,
what
yeah,
I
yeah,
see.
exactly,
So
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Great point. Let let's talk around what we were actually going to talk around, which is around kind of marketing data. Sorry,
Yes.
I got completely taken away
No.
by listening
No.
to you. So yeah, it's kind of shedding light onto kind of the how to effectively use data when building kind of marketing campaigns and marketing strategies. And I guess the first thing is again come back to kind of where we start, but more around kind of marketing data. What should we be? What data should we be looking for in the first place?
Yeah, the great thing about all these new platforms and software packages, James, is many of them already have pre-built-in analytics packages with them, so that you can look through and even just transactionally look through what is happening. So, the first step is just to make sure that you understand kind of what those analytics are saying or what they're providing you. And I'll use this example because it's a pretty simple one. Click through rates, where you do a post and you click through and then there's the next action and you take a look. you know that is a helpful way to see from end to end how the process might work. And then oftentimes, even though that might be a microcosm, it gives you an idea of kind of how the process is going to flow. And almost all the marketing and data analytics packages have some type of um, uh, rudimentary metrics like that, which are helpful. It's just a matter of tapping into them. The second, though, and this is a little bit more, is that becoming familiar and okay with some of the terminology that's used. So, for example, click through rate, which is always CTR. Um, those numbers sometimes are often surprisingly small, but the more important part of that analytic is, okay, is there something that's going, once that click through happens, is there a next level action? And I think that's oftentimes we get focused on the number and not the next progression into that number. So I would say, for anybody that's actually starting this out or really beginning to dive deeper into it, don't be too surprised if you see smaller numbers. It's okay. What you want to do is to be able to discern the difference between what that action is and what the next level behavior is. And that oftentimes is you just need to kind of follow the data through the pipeline.
And a lot of times in marketing, we have what I think I describe, but I think a lot of people describe as vanity metrics as well, right?
Yes.
The things around kind of the amount of views you might be getting, the amount of clicks on something. I know this is specific to social media, which is very niche to what we're discussing, but you know, do they do are they vanity metrics? Can they be useful? Because there's not really much we can kind of necessarily glean from that, or maybe there is. Maybe you can kind of shed a bit of
I
light into that,
it's a really good question, and there's no particular correct answer to it. Number one is they're always going to be vanity metrics, simply because we have to for job preservation, if nothing else. But in marketing, I do think that some of the vanity metrics need to be refreshed on a regular basis. Because if for example, if you're using Net Promoter Score, which is everybody in the seems to flock to that score, that oftentimes needs to be relooked at and refreshed and whatever. The second is that from my standpoint at least, is that you just need to make certain that whatever vanity metric you have, or whatever those metrics are, is that they are clearly explained and supported by the data. Because that is, if you're going to get in trouble, that's where it's going to wind up.
yeah.
Because you're going to be out there with a number that just doesn't seem right, or you're going to be kind of too self-promoting with the number, like 4 out of 5 X do this. You just want to make sure that you're really standing on thick ice with those numbers. But
So that's interesting. You bring up Net Promoter Score. And then that's a formula that's only now starting to be used a bit more within the staffing and recruitment space.
yep.
And I got the sense that maybe you weren't necessarily a fan, maybe, or it's too broad. It doesn't really give you much
It's
data. So yeah,
Yeah,
so
and that's the real downside, James, is that it's so broad, and it's so uh, easily misinterpreted, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, or there's a lot of weight that's put on the NPS score. There's some other questions that usually go into ask that roll into that number, but again, when I worked at Gallup, we came up with what was called the Q12, and everybody would always question, well, is it really just 12? Is it and I think sometimes when you get into those, you get vanity metrics or those hyper, like one-off metrics, you run the danger of not having a really true score of where you are. And I could see, that number, if that becomes the holy grail, or that becomes you know it does have an implication for the way you market, the way you position yourself, the way you brand yourself, all those different types of things. And so, I'm not a big fan of it, only because there's so many more elements to just that,
Yeah.
to the branding and marketing and positioning, than just that one question.
So follow up question then, for anyone out there who is using Net Promoter Score, or who's looking to use Net Promoter Score, what could we do different? How could we kind of, how could we do this better then? How could we get more from it?
Yeah, I think two particular things. Number one is that when you see the score, check it on a monthly basis, or check it on a quarterly basis, either one. But look at the numbers behind it that make that up, and usually those are pretty easily accessible. And so you want to make sure that you're just seeing what's behind the curtain versus just what's in front of the curtain. The second is that. I would say probably once every 6 months, run a counter question to that Net Promoter Score to see if there is an app, something that might be moving in a different direction that the Net Promoter Score is not picking up. For example, because the basis of the Net Promoter Score is likelihood to recommend, and in some businesses, it's very difficult for let's say in the staffing group, I may not be in that consideration set for a particular position. So how could I recommend you to go here? Or, so I think in one regard, the it's at least a baseline to work from, but don't make it the absolute, and look at the numbers behind it, and
Yeah.
and work with it from there.
Yeah, it seems to be, like I said, I think it seems to be very broad and a kind of a catch-all, and I think it can be misinterpreted to try and as a complete representation of your business, or even grandly down to a certain person, when actually one question is never going to be enough in those
Exactly.
situations. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Um, Peter, do you know what? We're going to have you back at some point, because
Oh,
we could talk about this kind of all day. We
awesome.
haven't kind of really touched the sides of what I kind of wanted to kind of what we were going to talk about, but you know what? We'll make it much more structured next time, and we'll come up with
Excellent. Okay.
but in all honesty, I think that you kind of got a huge kind of knowledge around this space, and then I think a lot of kind of ideas there that the audience will really kind of tune into. So we'll
Awesome.
figure out another day for you to kind of come back, and we'll tackle. We might see if we can kind of specifically kind of look at the more around the recruitment and staffing space.
Awesome.
Um, but for now, we will obviously include all your kind of details in the show notes. So if anybody
Terrific.
wants to reach out and get in contact, they can. But for now, Peter Shafer, thank you very much.
James, thank you very much. Great to see you.